Thanks, Patrick. Actually, I'll just dive right in. My first skateboard was a 24-inch Bane with Chicago trucks and Cadillac wheels. I lived in the Encino Hills, which was not quite the valley, and it was not quite sort of the cool beach or city area. This was around 1975, 1976. I was the youngest of three brothers. And we were just fascinated with skateboarding. I mean, that was kind of all we did. Evil Knievel was on Wide World of Sports at this time. There was this sort of sense of wanting to be a daredevil. And so most afternoons, I was the youngest of the three of us skateboarding down this steep hill where we lived. And Skateboarder magazine was out at the time, and we were fascinated by the Dogtown skateboarders. And it was interesting because it was partly their style on the board, but it was also the way they dressed and the long hair. And it was all this kind of, what's the word? It just sort of looked, they looked like outlaws. There was this appeal that in our nuclear family and mom and dad trying to raise us right, it just looked like this was attractive. And so, in 1976, I was 10 years old. My oldest cousin, Jeff, who was 14, I don't know how it happened that I ended up with him, just the two of us. But we were at his parents were divorced, and we were in West LA, and he said, let's get on the bus and let's go skate the box pool. And I'd heard a lot about the box pool. It was an empty pool in kind of Bel Air, Beverly Hills. So we got on the bus, we went over there, and Jeff said, as we were about to get off the bus to go to the pool, he said, if anyone asks, you tell them you live in Santa Monica and that you go to John Adams Elementary School. And that was because I was sort of from the valley. And so I had to keep that in my head. And so we hiked up this ice plant and we went into this backyard, and it was actually a rectangle, but they called it the box pool. But there was a square pool, there were a bunch of kids skating it. They were long haired, some were barefoot. There was a little tape beatbox thing, and I think it was playing Aerosmith, and I was just thrown into this thing of like, how do you do this? And my cousin Jeff had skated many pools. Where the light should be, there was just a hole, and everyone was either going over the top of it or coming up, doing a really tight turn to the side of it. But I did my first run, and I sort of aimed for the light and came down, and I was all excited and just feeling it. And then Jeff went, and he went up high, and then the next guy went and carved around it. And at the time, it was sort of, there was the light, there were the tiles, and then there was the coping. Those were like the three measures. And so the second one, I thought I'm going to aim for the light. So I aimed for the light, kind of got maybe two wheels out on it, came down, and then one of the guys goes to my cousin, wow, he skates good, thinking like I'm the little brother or something. And my cousin goes, it's his first pool. And I was like, oh, I got a compliment in my first pool. And then, so the next run I pushed a little harder, and I went up to the light, and as I was kick turning my trucks, I went weightless, the trucks went into the light hole, hung up on the trucks, and I fell straight down on my head and just crashed in my hands. And then everything's sort of blurry, and I see my cousin, and he leaves the skateboard, comes down, lugs me kind of over his shoulders, and takes me out and puts me on the bench, on the what would be the stairs to get into the pool if there were water. And I'm just sort of sitting there seeing stars, and suddenly I sort of smell this foreign thing, and this hand reaches over, and Jeff goes, here, smoke some of this. And I get this joint thrown into my mouth, and he's like, breathe in deep and hold it in, and I kind of inhale, and I instantly start coughing. And as I'm coughing, it's like, here, drink some of this. And there's a Heineken beer spilled into my mouth, and I'm 10 years old, and so everyone's around me, and I want to be cool, I want to be awesome, and so from there, I was not only like my head from the skateboarding accident, but stoned and drunk for the very first time. And we went. Next thing you know, I'm sort of looking up, and there's like a 30-foot monkey ape on stage swiping at airplanes, and we're watching King Kong at the New Wilshire Theater on Wilshire Boulevard. And I remember falling asleep in the movie, and then the next morning I woke up. I wasn't well. My mother took me to the hospital. I came out and I had a concussion, and I'd broken my thumb, and so I had a cast on my hand. And so that was like that was maybe, my early entry into that skate world that was so attractive. But shortly thereafter, my family moved from the Encino Hills out to Westlake Village, which was suburbia, and at the time it was kind of this planned suburban community with saplings, and there was kind of no history, and it was a strange thing where I think I was 11, my brothers were 12 and 13, but we just intuitively sensed that this is not where we wanted to be, and it was the sense of like we hate where we live, and we kind of conspired together how bad it was. And shortly after we skateboarded all around there, and then we found surfing, and that was on a trip to Hawaii. It was 1979. We did it was a package deal, Pleasant Hawaiian Holidays, Oahu, Kauai, and the Big Island. And we rented Maury Doyle's, which were the soft tops at the time, and there was an instructor who sort of explained how to do it. But we went out and we got, we mostly fell, but we got a little bit of rhythm, and we realized it was this interesting thing because it was sort of like everything that we were doing on skateboards, we kind of did it in reverse. Like the surf history came first, and then skateboarding was the surf surrogate. It was what you did when you couldn't surf. We'd learned all these tricks in skateboarding. We didn't even know when we were ducking under hedges that was like a faux tube, and that's, So when we came to surfing, it was it was kind of a natural evolution. But it continued to provide the problem of we're inland, we're in the valley, we're not at the beach, we're not where we want to be. So we kept surfing, we kept getting better at surfing. I'm the youngest of the three brothers, we're all kind of mutually into it. And then in 1979, so the trip to Hawaii was 77. So in 79, we went to Europe on a trip. And it was a trip that my dad wanted to do to kind of educate us and expand us. And he realized that his kids were sort of falling into being hedonists. So he was trying to kind of expand it. And while there, we found punk rock. Punk rock was starting in London, or it was going in London for a while, but it was interesting because the aesthetic of punk rock appealed the exact same way the skateboarding did. It was sort of the same way the Dogtown guys look so cool, the punk guys look so cool. And when we were leaving Europe, after driving around for a month, we get on the plane, and we have to be seated right next to a guy who just looks exactly like Sid Vicious. He's got like spiky black hair, and he's wearing wraparound glasses, and he's got a torn up t-shirt and like safety pins in his ears. And my brothers and I just, bombarded him with questions the entire time, and he was actually quite cool. And he had a box or a bag of records. He was collecting vinyl. He's on his way to New York, and the flight was Heathrow to JFK to LA, and he was getting off at JFK. And as he was about to leave, he said, I've happened to have 2 copies of Richard Hell and the Voidoids, The Blank Generation. You guys can have one. And he gave us this record, and it was. So we go home, we start listening to it nonstop, and then that led us into the punk scene. And so it was a great time. This was 1979, 1980, and punk was spreading throughout Los Angeles, and it was hitting the beach. So there were punks at the beach. And the two things, the surfing and the punk rock, seemed to sort of pair so well for a minute, but then I realized that, to go to all the shows was to kind of go out late at night, and to go surfing seriously would be to get up at dawn. And so my brother Steven, middle brother, and me kind of kept with the surfing. My oldest brother Kevin kept going with the punk, and it was like this clear bifurcation. And right around that same time, it was late summer, we're at Third Point, so we've been surfing Malibu a lot, and Malibu is just an incredibly colorful environment at that time. We had nicknames for everyone out there. There was a lot of great surfing happening, but it was very much of the, winger pintail 7.2 single fin style, the kind of very slow moves. It wasn't longboarding, but it definitely wasn't high performance shortboarding of that time. And one day we're there at Malibu, we're trading waves, all our little crew of friends, and we look out and we suddenly see these guys just flying through the lineup in bright wetsuits. They're dark-skinned, they're riding twin fins, and they're kind of surfing like this high-octane surfing that we'd never ever seen before. And right at that same time, suddenly like a truck pulls up on the beach and starts to set up a scaffolding. And it turns out that this would be the 1979 Sunkist Pro, which was won by Button's Kaluhio Kalani. And the surfers that we saw on the water were all the Town and Country team. It was Dane Kealoha, Randall Kim, Calvin Maeda, Vince Klein, etc. And just watching what they were doing on the wave it was so appealing, and it was the bright colors, and it was just aesthetically it appealed the same. It's just, and maybe, you know, it's interesting because it's sort of that age you just drink it up, but it was like Dogtown turned to the water or the punk rock turned to the water. But we watched all that. It was really, really exciting. And that got my brother Steven and me into competitive surfing. And we started entering contests. My older brother continued on the punk deal. And next, I did well in contests. It came really easily. The first contest I surfed in was at Malibu. I got second, and then from there I started entering a lot and started winning them, got sponsored, and started to clearly, you know, see this idea of being a pro surfer. And at the time, it wasn't an established route. It certainly wasn't something my father would be into. But I had kind of mentors showing me the way, and I continued to do well in the contests. My contemporaries at that time were like Brad Gerlach. Tom Kern was a couple years older. He was just about to join the pro ranks. And it was this interesting kind of conflict or push and pull, because on the one hand, the sort of things that appealed about surfing when we started was this wildness, but now it was kind of being professionalized or athleticized. It was, and it was, there was the NSSA, and to get on the NSSA national team, you had to get like a good grades in school. So it kind of countered what had appealed in the beginning, but there was also this way to keep surfing, which was, you know, to do well. And I got sponsored by Quicksilver, Channel Islands, Rip Curl wetsuits, kept doing well in the contests. And so I was bringing home trophies, feeling really good about it. My middle brother wasn't doing as well as me, and that we were kind of growing distant. My oldest brother was deep in the punk scene and coming home later and later at night and sort of getting stranger and stranger. And in 1982, which was about 5 days before he would graduate high school, he went to a high school party, and he went through kind of a sense of being a deep outsider. I don't even know how to put it, but he drove my father's car to an alley and slashed his wrists, and came home, and he went to his bed to, you know, hopefully never wake up. But my mother had some sense that something was wrong, and she went and intervened and saw that he was slashed up and took him to the hospital. He got like 60 stitches in his wrists, and so that sort of changed. This sugary life that I was on was dramatically changed in that moment. It was like, you know, I'm trying to do this thing, getting sponsored, I'm hanging out with these lighthearted kids, but then this is going on at home. So he went to UC Berkeley. He was a very well-educated, you know, really, really smart guy. But when he so he was using heroin, I should say. When he went to Berkeley, it just got worse. And so there was a period, the period where I was trying to make my pro career happen. My family life was a wreck. My mother and father were spreading apart for a lot of reasons, but presumably my brother's drug addiction did not help. And so I had this kind of like great escape life where I would go up and down the coast surfing contests and doing well, which was great, but also coming home to just things falling apart. And so Quicksilver was my sponsor. They sort of dangled this carrot of, if you win the West Coast Championships, we'll buy you a ticket to Australia and you can turn pro. So I won the West Coast Championships, and in 1986 I went on my first pro tour foray trip. And the first event was the Stubbies at Burley Heads, which was terrific because I've been studying Burley Heads in the magazines and movies before that. Saw all my favorite surfers. I mean, I went to this hotel and literally, like, going out for my first surf in Australia, I pushed the elevator because it's this high rise at Burley Heads, and I walk in and there's Mark Richards coming out of the water with this MR Superman board. And, you know, all my favorite surfers were out there, and there was, and so I was thrown into that world. But it was interesting because that pro tour at that time was, it was part it was getting more and more professional, but there was definitely this other side to it where, like, my first night, I surfed Burley Heads with all my heroes, and then someone dragged me to Jupiter's Casino that night, and I was out till like 3 a.m. and came home, completely hammered, and so began my pro surfing career. There was a lot of that, like, going back and forth between those two things. But it was very clear to me that I wanted to, keep pushing and keep getting better, and I wanted to make a pro surfing life work. So I had this great trip, and I come home, and my brother's, still in it, and I'm kind of skipping forward with years, but he's in and out of rehabs. There was jail time. There was a lot of this stuff. And my sponsorship, I didn't get enough money from my sponsors to, like, do all the events on the tour, so it was kind of piecemeal, just pick up whatever I could. So the 86 season kind of slid by, didn't get to do much. I went on whatever trip I could. When I was home, I was surfing Malibu and working really, really hard at it. In 1987, the tour started, and I thought, this is the year I'm going to really apply myself, and if I can get in the top 30, then I can really have a life. Because at this time, it was like the top 44 is now. The top 30 surfers were seeded. Then they put 2 wild cards in each event to make it even. But if you were in the top 30, you were making, like 40 grand a year, maybe minimum, which to me seemed like an incredible deal, because I was kind of getting by on like 15 grand and selling boards as I went. So I go, the first event is in Japan. I get an equal 33rd. I earn $350, and I get kind of my name on the rankings. And then the next event was in Hawaii. I got another 33rd. I'm doing well. Next event is South Africa, and I do okay. And I'm sitting like 27th on the rankings. We're a few events in. And at that time, my brother, who'd been struggling with his addiction, he'd managed like a period of sobriety to where my father, who always loved to travel to Europe, he'd said, if you can manage sobriety for a certain amount of time, I'll take you along on this trip I'm doing to Europe. And this was with my younger sister. And by the way, I have a younger sister. I've left her out only because she wasn't part of the surfing thing that we did. And so my father, my oldest brother, and my sister went to Europe. And at that time, I was in South Africa. They were there for a month. And I came back from South Africa and flew Durban, Johannesburg, Heathrow, Los Angeles, and instead of going home to check in with the family, I went straight down to the Stubbies Pro in Oceanside. And I was like on such a good groove, one contest after another. I was feeling really confident. And so the waves are small and good and kind of to my liking, and I'm all revved up to make this top 30, and I get through the trials, and then I surf against Australian Bryce Ellis, and I beat him in the 33rd round, and then the next round is the equal 17th round, and I draw Mark Occhilupo. And it's like it's a Friday, Oceanside, sunny, tons and tons of people, and it's on the north side of the pier, so the pier is lined with people, and they're cheering. And at this time, I feel like I'm kind of an imposter, but I have done okay in a couple of events, and people actually know my name. They're cheering my name, like they're rooting for the American, and I go out and do the best I can, but Aki blows me away, of course. And when I get out of the water, there are people, waiting out to meet me and get my autograph. And so I'm excited about all this. The Quicksilver people are there watching me and seeing like, oh, Jamie, we got him on the Pro Tour. We're barely giving him any money, but he's kind of making it happen. Good stuff. That evening, I get a note that I've got to call some reporter for the LA Times because he's doing a piece about pro surfing, and he wants me to be the subject of the piece. So I, have a conversation with him. I'm all excited, and then the next morning, I realized like the contest is over. I haven't been home. I've been on the road. I should go home and check in with the family. A guy I knew at the event said, I'm headed back up to Malibu. I can give you a lift. So I go up to Malibu. And there's a WSA event happening, and WSA was kind of the contest body that I graduated from. So it was almost like going back to your high school and you're off at Harvard or something like that, and you're kind of like doing great out in the world, and you go back and there's this contest on, and everyone's like, oh, they'd already heard about my 17th, which for me was a big deal. And I'm getting congratulated, and I'm kind of smugly walking along, and then I see this guy who lives where we do, and he goes, hey Jamie, have you been home? And I said no, and he goes, your brother's dead. And I just have this like whoosh, wash over me, and I'm like, no, that can't be true. And I literally, I think I thanked him. I was like, I'd like had this stupid smile on my face, and I was like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, great, And as I walk to try to, find out if this is actually happening, and I'm down on the beach at Third Point, so it's a long walk to the payphones at Malibu to call home. This is back in the payphone days, 1987. As I'm walking, I'm thinking, this can't be true, this can't be true, this can't be true. And as I'm walking, I'm running into people that I know, because at this time I was very entrenched in the surf scene there. And they're telling me, congratulations on your event, on the stubbies, and how was South Africa and all this. And I'm just like, I'm like sitting here like trying to process what I've just heard, hoping it's not true, and like smiling my way through this kind of conversation. Just like, yeah. Finally, I get to the payphones, and the moment I call, put a quarter in or whatever it was, and I call my mom, and just instantly from the tone of her hello, I know what's happened. And so she says, where are you? And I said, I'm at Malibu, but I'm without a car. And she goes, I'm going to come get you right now. And so I have this moment where my mom's coming to get me. It's going to be about 30 minutes because we lived in the valley, and I'm at Malibu. I know everyone there, and I'm just like, okay, I've got to meet her. We arranged a spot to meet, but I've got about 30 minutes, and I don't want to run into anyone because I don't want to like have to pretend or be real or whatever. So I walk across PCH, and there's kind of this bluff where they shoot a lot of lineup shots of Malibu, and I kind of climb up into this tumbleweed and chaparral, whatever, and I'm sitting up there, and I'm trying to process all this stuff, and I look, and I'm wearing like these bright blue Quicksilver sweats with like a big Quicksilver logo down the side, and I'm wearing patent leather red Adidas like Run DMC high top sneakers, and I'm sitting here like trying to cry because I think I'm supposed to cry, not knowing what to process, and I'm looking down at just this like clown outfit of like my pro surfing life, and I'm thinking, like I have this thought that I'd never ever would have imagined, but it's sort of like, the logos should never ever like be a part of the grieving process. You should, when you're trying to like think about my brother's 23 years of my life with him and the fact that he's gone. Like, I shouldn't be looking at Adidas sneakers, for God's sake. My mother picks me up. We, go home. We have the whole funeral. We have all that stuff. But I'm trying to sort of defend my way in the pro surfing ranks. So I'd missed the OP Pro, which was the event after the stubbies. And then I plummeted. Like, I was 27th, and now I'm like 38th or whatever. And the next leg of the tour is Lacanau, France. So I've had this like 8 days off or whatever it is, missed the OP Pro. All my peers, and at this point, they're all my best friends are the pro surfers. They're there, they're like climbing above me on the rankings, and now it's time to go to France. So my mother and father dropped me off at the airport. And at the time there was Par Avion Travel, a travel agency that booked everyone together. So I walk into the airport, and there's just like a sea of my fellow surfers with their big coffin board bags waiting to get on, Pan Am flight such and such to Bordeaux or to Paris. And no one, I don't know how to approach them. They kind of don't know how to approach me. Like what I'm going through is nothing that you want to, there's sort of no place for it in this, like the sort of shorthand of like being a pro surfer, where it's like, oh, how's that board? And so I just sort of dip into this kind of almost like in denial of everything that I was going through, and fly over. I'm with friends. We fly to Paris, and then I think we had another flight to Bordeaux, and then we rented cars and we headed out to Lacanau, which is a seaside village, and it's like a holiday resort. The contest is on. I get a little wave in the night before, and then I go to sleep in the hotel, totally jet lagged, and it turns out I have like one of the first heats in the morning. And I wake up, go out for my heat, and lose right away. And so I suddenly go, okay, now I'm even further away from this top 30 ranking that I want, and I sort of try to process it all. That night, everyone's going out to rage because we're all in France and it's fun, and so I kind of join in the raging, and the raging just sort of keeps going. And so that was sort of like how the rest of my tour years went. And I had a couple of moments, but it really was this like struggling to sort of, there was this thing that I kind of had like postpone processing, or I kind of just like, I'm going to evade, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to kind of try to continue to be this like Rocky Balboa, just clench my fists and be an athlete, and also the raging parties that would always happen. But I did all that stuff. And I managed a third in a event in Brazil. I managed a third in the event in South Africa. So there were a couple of decent results, but for the most part, I was a middling pro surfer. And then I started spending a lot of time in Australia. I met a girl there. We were really serious. But I was sort of struggling on tour, and I sort of just knew I was on borrowed time. It was like, how long can I keep this thing going? 1991, there's sort of a soft recession, and there's also the emergence of Kelly Slater, who Quicksilver has signed for the most lucrative contract in surf history, which sort of served the walking papers to several of us. So I knew, like, okay, now's my time. I'm done. And I had this moment where it's like, maybe I can try to keep it going, but it's not making sense. And but I'm living in Sydney, and I'd read a lot. I'd always kept notebooks and diaries while traveling. And so it was very fortunate. I was out surfing one day at Bungan, which is a spot near Newport Beach area, northern beaches of Sydney, and I ran into my friend Andrew Kidman, who was the editor of Waves magazine at the time. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm off the tour. I'm just trying to figure out my way." And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I was like, "I don't know. I mean, I like to write, and I'm interested in. I read a lot." And he goes, "Are you interested in magazines?" And I said, "Totally, I am." And he said, "Well, I need an associate editor for Waves, and I've got a small budget to hire someone. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Totally." And he said, "Okay, well, come, and I'll introduce you to the publisher, and we can see what happens." And so I instantly get hired, and I get this job. And so as I'm sort of thinking like my dream is over, my dream to be a pro surfer is over, very quickly this new opportunity comes, and that is to work for a magazine and to kind of document surf culture. And the big revelation was I'd been kind of doing the best I could, and in many ways I realized it was going against my character, but I was trying to keep the blinders on to be an athlete. And while this sounds contradictory because there was the parties and all that kind of stuff, but for the most part we knew what the right thing to do was, and the right thing to do was to sort of just be focused. And when the blinders peeled away and I was working for a magazine, it was encouraged to be curious and to be interested and to go see music and to go, see art and sort of embrace things as opposed to just being a jock. It was so incredibly liberating, and I almost had this sense of sort of overcompensating for the blinders on life that I'd been living for a long time. So Sydney was great, and the girlfriend and I had fallen apart. I spent a year there kind of learning, working at the magazine, and then I realized that I wanted to be back in California, so I moved to LA. And I continued to freelance. One very important note, that year in Sydney, when I'd given up on my pro surfing dream and I worked at Waves and Tracks, and I was trying to learn what it meant to be sort of a writer and a magazine editor. The fascinating thing was I did the best surfing of my entire life. And I always liken it to the kind of Chinese finger trap thing where, like, for 5 years of being on tour and for 10 years of being a competitive surfer, I was trying so hard to make it happen. And I look back on videos of myself back then, and it's there. It's this sort of way too wound up. And when that process of, I'm no longer a pro surfer, there's nothing at stake here, but I've kind of trained myself to surf for all these years, and I've surfed the best waves in the world. It was so interesting just to kind of go, wow, I'm out of this game now, but it's the best surfing I've ever done. I've never felt more in my skin on a surfboard. So it was the beginning of a very valuable lesson. So I moved back to LA. I start freelancing for magazines. I want to get away from surfing, and I start working for Bikini Magazine, which Bikini was part of Ray Gun Publishing. They were really big in the early 90s. Ray Gun was David Carson, who was this great graphic designer. It was a music magazine. Bikini was kind of like the pop culture mag. And I got great assignments away from surfing. I went to write about the Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam, which was interesting. Another magazine sort of knew I was hungry for pieces, and I got the assignment to write about S&M in LA, and I knew absolutely nothing about S&M. I was averaging about $300 a story at the time, and this English editor who I don't know why he did this, but he said, I'd really love for someone to write about the S&M scene in Los Angeles, and I've got $2,000 for you to do it. And I was like, $2,000, it's ridiculous, fantastic. But I had no idea kind of what S&M is for the most part. And so I have this friend, and I said, look, I've got to write this story. You want to hang with me a little bit? Let's try to make this happen. And he said, sure. And I said, I've heard about this place on Santa Monica Boulevard. It's called Club Fuck, and it happens every Thursday night. And so I dragged my friend along to Club Fuck, and we walk in, and it's a classic sort of S&M scene like you would see in a movie. And in the back is the whipping room. And my friend and I go to the whipping room, and there's a stage, and there's a place where a guy's like a what do you call that thing? He's turned upside down, but he's shackled on, and there's a woman in leather just whipping him, and then the music's thumping, and then she decides to take a break, and she's got a cigarette, and she comes over, and I'm standing on the edge of the stage like this, and I said, hey, and she comes over, and I said, listen, I got this assignment to write about S&M. I don't really know much about the scene. Can you help me out? And she's like, smoking, and she says, well, my name is Duchess DeSade, and I work in a dungeon in Culver City called Lady Laura's Dominion. I'll give you my number. You can meet me there. We can talk. And I said, okay, sure. She's like, scribbles her phone number down, and then right then the song changes, and the dominatrix who's doing the whipping is done, and she's like, I'm up, and she runs away, and as she runs away, she flicks her cigarette, and it just rolls and just hits me right here. It's like, that was good stuff. I ended up writing this piece, which I knew nothing about, and I didn't, there's no great punchline to my S&M piece story, other than the fact that it was something that was so unfamiliar to me, and it was just so cool to kind of do that, because I'd only written about surfing, and the surfing at this point was, I was less interested in it. It was sort of like doing the same thing, and it was kind of a perfect time to move on. So I ended up doing a lot of pieces that had nothing to do with surfing, which was great. And it made me realize I had this strange epiphany, because while I was a pro surfer, all my friends, the folks of the Malibu scene that knew me, they were like, hey, world traveler, and it was like they were complimenting me, which was nice, but in fact, like, I had this realization that all I've really done is hug the coastline in my travels. Yes, I've been to all these countries, but I really, I've never really exited the surf scene. It's always been among people who are kind of praying to the same God, so to speak. It felt so homogenized. I'd be in France, I'd be in Portugal, Brazil, whatever, but I'd be hanging out with surfers, and it was the same deal. Supposedly there's a swell coming tomorrow, blah 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 blah. So being in LA at that time was great, and I was getting exposed to a lot of stuff, but then suddenly, and I was writing for Surfing Magazine, I was a staff writer there, and traveling, they were sending me on trips, which was great, but suddenly there was a spot open to be the editor of Surfing Magazine, and the publisher said, your name's come up, Jamie, would you be interested? And I said, absolutely, I'd be interested, because I was living hand to mouth. I was living in Venice and living this kind of like extreme bohemian lifestyle. And I said, yes, I'd like to put my hand up for it. So I went down, interviewed, got the gig, and became the editor of Surfing Magazine. This was 1998, 99. And it was immediately, I hate to say it, but not a great experience. And this is because I think the time that I stepped into it, it was when surfing was becoming more, surf magazines were owned by bigger publishing companies that had multiple public magazines, and they wanted to see profit. So there was just a lot of pressure. It wasn't like those old romantic surfer magazine days where everyone's kind of like barefoot in there and doing what they do, and it was becoming very corporatized. And then the other thing that was really, really difficult was just seeing how much the advertisers sort of bullied around the editorial. And as someone who grew up with the myths of surfing, I mean, surfing was so big to me. And I can remember being, a kid hoping to they're doing the Malibu article. Maybe I can get my picture in the magazine when I'm 14 years old. And I don't get it. But I sort of had this puritanical, I imposed this purist vision on what the magazines were like. And when I got behind the scenes, I realized, well, maybe I didn't have the right sponsor at the time, or my sponsor wasn't renting the back page for the advertising at that time. It was just disillusioning. And I realize now, it wasn't so much, it's not that the surf magazines are so terribly corrupt, but it was just that I had such a pure idea of how they should be. And it was my early love of surfing was so pure that it was disillusioning to be a part of that. And so, and as the editor of Surfing Magazine, I had to go to a lot of parties. And when I say had to go, it was because I was like this figurehead for the magazine. A lot of them were put on by, advertisers or prospective advertisers. So there was kind of a wink of like, you should probably go to that party. And I got disillusioned not only on the surf, working for the surf mag, but for the sort of surf industry and for what my friends will call the Bermuda Triangle. And it's the idea that once you're in it, you'll never get out of it. And so knowing 2.5 years into my job at Surfing Magazine, I just realized I got to get as far away from this world as I can. And so when I completed the job, sort of like right after I got out, finished the job, went on a trip to Tabarua, wrote about a surf contest there, and then came back and then moved to New York. And in New York, I vowed to, a couple of things. One, I vowed to not work for anyone ever again, because when I was doing the job at Surfing Magazine, the idea of people looking at me sideways because I showed up at 9:30, not 8:30, but what they did not know that I was up till like 3 a.m. writing captions on the printouts of the magazine. There was this thing of I don't want to work for someone that has this narrow, imposes these narrow ideas onto it. And I think today's world, like I think. Silicon Valley's it's different. There's appreciation for working on a home and all this stuff. But at that time, it was just so clear to me that I didn't want to work for anyone, and I needed to be able to figure out how to make it as a freelance writer. So I moved to New York, started doing that. Surfing kind of chased me there. I didn't know it, but I was expanding. And when I thought years earlier that I wanted to leave the surf world, I didn't take into account that the surfing is this sort of live organism, and the tentacles are spreading out, and they're going inland, they're going to big cities. It's sort of cross-pollinating with music and art and other cultural things that I'm interested in. So when I moved to New York, it was sort of great to write about surfing. And the first job I did was I edited a magazine called Big, and it was a surf issue. And so I was there enjoying New York. I was kind of moving through the city that first year the way I moved through surfing my first year, where it was just so exciting to be there, and I was taking it all in, and it was kind of this world that my surfing life never would have taken me to otherwise, had I not kind of consciously tried to get off that track. And then 9/11 happened. At that time I was in Portugal surfing, and I went back to the city, and probably 1 month after 9/11, I'm there, and a friend of mine invites me over to dinner, and he says, and there's this friend that's going to be there, and I walk into his house, and I meet Gisela Mata, who would become my wife. And she was from Brazil. She was making a documentary about New York. It was called Nova York, um mês depois, New York 1 month after. And it was sort of this trying to understand what happens to a place after a tragedy like 9/11. So it was interviewing people in Lower Manhattan. It was getting statistical data on like the rising sale of alcohol and tobacco. And as we would learn about 8 or 9 months later, there was a lot of fornication happening in the wake of 9/11. Kids were born 9 months later. So she was working on this thing. We fell in love. We started up this wonderful relationship. We kind of lived hand to mouth in New York. Shitty little apartments. Then we would go to Sao Paulo or Rio. She was a documentary filmmaker. She was trying to make her thing happen. I was trying to make my writing happen. I'd done right around that time a book called Have Board Will Travel: The History of Surf, Skate, and Snow. Most of it I wrote in Encinitas at my dear friend Garth's house, and that came out, and it got me an agent, and I had a really great literary agent in New York. And one day over lunch I was telling him much the same stuff I'm telling you now, although much briefer, and he said, you should write a memoir about your life. It's interesting stuff, and the kind of tension of your brother and you trying to be an athlete. You should write a memoir. And so I was all excited, and somewhere I think on that original lunch when he said it, I said, what would that, what does a memoir do? And he's like, well, they're real popular right now. I mean, you're not going to be riding around town in a limousine, but we could maybe get you $100,000 as an advance. And I rode my skateboard home, just so damn excited. And I went back to my apartment, and at the time I had this marijuana tobacco habit that was insidious, and I couldn't stop, and I rolled up a joint and I just like smoked it. I thought, like, I'm going to write a memoir in a year, I'm going to get $100,000, and my career is just going to go. And so I started writing the thing, and probably 6 months later, I shared it with my agent, and he read it. And when he called, he's like, I got to call you and tell you what I think. And we had this time scheduled, and I had my notepad with my pen, and he says, Jamie, if this is what it's going to be like, I'm not sure. This is it's not. I don't know if I can sell it. And I said, what's wrong? And he's like, well, there's just some things that's just not. It's not what I was thinking about in terms of a surf memoir. So began what would be it's still going actually, but I spent the next 10 years trying to write this memoir about my surfing life, and it didn't work, and it continued to almost get worse, and I continued to go into more of this kind of writer's block because he started telling me how he thought it should be, and I'm this lifelong surfer having a guy who he was a great dude but knows nothing about surfing sort of telling me like what's saleable in the New York publishing world. So I just kept struggling to write this thing. Meanwhile, my lovely wife Gisela, her career is getting better and better, and she's doing TV shows for Brazil that are taking her around the world, and sometimes we're going to live in Sao Paulo for a couple of months while she does that. Sometimes we're going to live in London for a bit. And all that stuff's happening, but I'm still just failing to write this memoir, and it's really eating at me. And I have kind of this idea in my head that like the only way my life is going to be okay is to make this book work and get it published and have it whatever. I'm not hugely ambitious, but it's this sort of albatross of my life. And so, and just to qualify, this is over like many, many years. And so at one point, my wife and I are getting further and further distant. I'd applied for a writing residency at Yato, which is a arts residency in upstate New York, and I got it. I went to Yato. In some deluded state, I met a girl. I thought, in this kind of probably wanting to just escape my life, I just sort of threw myself into a relationship with someone. This was like over 10 days, but you have these accelerated sort of friendships that happen at these artist residencies. And then came home and sort of announced to my wife, like, I'm not in this anymore, and met this new person. Then I'm kind of, meanwhile, the latest version that I'd finished at the artist residency, my agent is shopping, and he's forwarding me the email saying, the book's not working. I'm in a new relationship. I'm wondering if the new relationship's working. About 8 months into the new relationship, I kind of realized it's definitely not working. And Giselle and I are still in touch. She's in Brazil working on some stuff. And one evening, I go to see my new girlfriend and just have this realization, like, just what the fuck are you doing with your life? And everything just is off. And you've got to get out of this relationship. I'm riding my bicycle home in New York. It's a rainy day. And at one point, I was trying to go up one of those little curb things that, there's a sidewalk and then there's the dips down, and it's that little lip. And if you don't hit it sort of at a right angle, much like a wave with a surfboard, it can kind of skitter you. And it skitters me, and I kind of fall into a car. And then I keep riding on and go home and proceed to get into a fight with the new girlfriend. And I'm sitting there like laying in bed going, it's not working. And I have this totally sleepless night of thinking about how fucked up everything is. And then at about 6:30 in the morning, I hear a text message, and it says, Jamie, call me now. And it's from Fernanda, who is Gisela's best friend. I call Fernanda, and she's wailing on the phone, and she says, Gisela's dead. And so she was at a friend's on Easter Sunday having dinner. She was riding home in Rio. She was living in Rio at the time. She was riding on the street. Going across the street, a bus made a wide turn. She didn't know it was turning. She ran into it. It threw her. It was Easter Sunday in a very Catholic country. The best staff was not there at the hospital that night. They thought she'd broken a hip. They diagnosed as a broken hip. She was bleeding internally, and that's how she died. But it was so fascinating. You just caught it. I had the thing on the bike the night before, and I'll never forget that. It was this incredible kind of synchronistic moment. And it stood out to me. Like, I almost ate shit on my bike. And if I do the math and the time, it was very much like it was that weird thing. If you saw it in a movie, you'd be like heavy-handed bullshit, and in real life, there was this incredible thing that was synchronistic. Yeah. And so I instantly go to Brazil and deal with that, and do the funeral, the whole thing. And while I'm there, I'm there for like a week. I think I was there for a couple of weeks, but while there, I didn't know I had so many lovely friends. And honestly, like that whole period, and when I say that whole period, I mean like that time of trying to write this memoir that I think is going to validate my existence. I feel it's like it's taking me further and further away from connection with people. And when she dies, I just get this outpouring of love from my friends. How are you doing? I'm so sorry, blah, 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 blah. And I don't answer any of it because I'm, of course, dealing with a funeral. Her family embraced me after all that. And then finally, about like 8 days later, I kind of like look at my emails and my Facebook things, and I just realize there's like about 100 emails I've got to respond to, and I think, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to like post on Facebook the lowdown, and I just start to tell how I met Gisela, and I just keep kind of writing entries, and it turns into like a serialized thing of our entire. We were together 11 years, and what happens is I get notes about it, and then it's like, this is the best thing you've never written so well in your life, and so I just keep doing it, and then I think, and I have to stay alive afloat, so I've got other writing stuff happening, but I'm just realizing like somehow, whatever kind of like mannered writing, whatever like trying too hard version of writing that I had been doing, whatever I thought that was supposed to connect was completely wrong. And it was just this thing of like having your life just devastated, like made you step back into a voice that is actually authentic and real and it's who you are. And so that was 6 years ago. And then one of my like survival thing that happened in my mind was the only thing that is absolutely worth doing now. I almost did this transference from the memoir to the memoir about Gisela, which is the only one thing I got to do before I die is write about my life with Gisela. And I kind of had done a version of it, but of course it was, it probably would have totaled like 6,000 words. It was like 15 pages or something. But I did end up a while later drawing from that. I kept tons of notes, and I wrote a piece for the Surface Journal. It was called The Dazzling Blackness, and it was about this whole story. And it was kind of framed with body surfing because I'd done a lot of body surfing in Brazil while she was there. I spent a lot of time with her while working, and I think it was probably the best. It was the thing I'm most proud of that I've written, and it was the thing that was like the most urgent, it needed to be written the way a lot of other things did not need to be written, But the thing that, so it was 6 years ago that Gisela died, but the thing that is so strange is like in the thick of that, in that year after she passed away, there was this like clearing of the haze or the sort of like gauze that hangs over our lives and for me personally, makes it hard to see the things that matter most. Just completely disappeared, and everything was there in sharp relief. And I'm definitely not going to like throw some platitude of like your friends or any of that stuff. I don't even know what it was, but there was on that edge, in that sense of sort of, I don't care whether I live or die at this point. I feel so shitty. Everything is wrong. The year after she died, every day I would apologize to the sky because I couldn't apologize to her. But there was, if all I want to do is get out of it. Like if someone said we can fast forward the clock 10 years, you're going to lose 10 years of your life, but you're not going to be feeling this raw way you do now. I would have said absolutely. And now 6 years later, I have to go back to that. I go back to that place all the time just to remember the rawness and to remember how real it all was. And again, I'm not going to end this with like tell the people you love. Like it's something like that, but it's more than that. But it was, I don't know, it was a thing of when I was younger, when I first started wanting to be a writer, it was sort of this I was overly eager to make it happen. And I kind of, I didn't have anything to draw from. And it was sort of, unexpectedly life threw me these things that kind of made me step deeper into who I am and to actually like, feel like, okay, well, I lack many things, one of which is an education, but life experience. There's been some stuff that's real, and there's a sense of like having accrued experience that helped me to go deeper into my writing. Last November, my house burned down. I'd made this great life for myself after, the year after she died was the worst year of my life, and then I moved back to Malibu and sort of things started to fall into place, and I ended up renting this beautiful guest house and having this wonderful surfing life, and everything was going really, really good. And then the Woolsey fire, November 8th and 9th, came. Everything burned, including, this is an interesting one, including all the notebooks that I'd written into about Gisela, which was going to be the memoir that I thought was the only thing that I was supposed to be doing in my life. It all burned, and everything else burned. I mean, I was so arrogant to think that the fire would not jump PCH and come to my house, and it did, and everything was gone. And then, so in the wake of that, about a week after it happened, I was talking to a friend who's a really great writer, and I was telling her the experience, and she said, this would be a great piece for the New Yorker. And I said, yeah. And she's like, I've written for the New Yorker. I'm going to email the editor that I know there and find out like who you would do this for. And then the next day that happens, and then the editor says, I'd be curious about the piece. And I realized the Woolsey fire was still a really hot topic, and Dana Goodyear, a New Yorker staff writer, was reporting on it. And I thought, this is not something I can spend 2 weeks writing. And in sort of about 2.5, 3 days, I just threw the thing out, sent it in, welcoming and expecting rejection. And the editor goes, this is really great. We're going to run it tomorrow. And so the New Yorker was a big deal for me because I'm not, I have a piecemeal college education. I'm mostly just a surfer who got to travel and read a lot, but I felt like the New Yorker seemed like it was a long way off, but the piece was published. I was real happy. And again, I had almost a deja vu, although it was not nearly as extreme as the loss of Gisela, but this idea of like this shitty thing happened to me, and yet in that kind of shock of it all, something in the writing, something got me to the heart of something, and I didn't try to do anything clever. I didn't try to do to like digress into anything. It was just like straight, trenchant words moving across the page, and it worked. And so that, I guess, that's what I got. that's my story.